So for those of you that just joined us, my name is Brian Bajak. I'm visiting assistant professor of theology at Marquette University. Following Joe Gordon's lead, I'll say I was also on the Lonergan Society board at Marquette University during my own time as a master's student here. And I am the director of the philosophy section of the International Institute for Method and Theology. So I'm extremely excited to be able to introduce this next presentation. Back in 2012 at Lonergan on the Edge, there was a panel on race, culture, bias, a number of themes extremely relevant to our time still, unfortunately, that consisted of Sean Copeland, Brian Massingale, John Nilsson, and two Marquette doctoral candidates, Dwayne Loynes and David Horsketter. And the following year, Bob and the Lonergan Society decided to inaugurate a funded presentation in honor of Sean and M. Sean Copeland's wonderful work in contextual theology. She's going to be giving our keynote address, for which I'm very excited, later today at 3:30. The presentation sort of honors a paper that is working within the areas of contextual theology that parallel Copeland's own work. So I'm thrilled for this next presentation, especially as somebody who works on Lonergan and intersubjectivity. And we have the privilege of hearing David de la Fuente from Fordham University presenting the Twofold Undertow, Hermeneutical Resources for Intersubjectivity in Paul Ricoeur and Willie James Jennings. So I'm going to hand it over to Dave. The floor is yours, sir.
This is good afternoon for me, but for some it might be good morning, good day, good evening. So good time wherever you are. It's really great to be with you all. I've been hoping to contribute to this conference for many years, and I guess the stars have aligned. Can you all hear me okay? I feel the pressure because you know how graduate student papers are, so we'll see where it goes, but I'm excited to think with you all. I've been thinking about two instances when Lonergan uses the image of the undertow, but I want to begin with the more obscure one. In the first lecture on religious experience in a third collection, Lonergan speaks of the massive undertow of inauthenticity in one's tradition. He identifies first the minor form of individual inauthenticity, but also the major form in which, quote, the words are repeated, but the meaning is gone. The religious order still reads out the rules and studies the constitutions, but one may doubt whether the home fires are still burning. Here, individual inauthenticity generates inauthenticity in the tradition. In such a situation, Lonergan observes, quote, so it is that commonly men have to pay a double price for their personal attainment of authenticity. Not only have they to undo their own lapses from righteousness, but more grievously, they have to discover what is wrong in the tradition they have inherited, and they have to struggle against the massive undertow it sets up. The cure, he later adds, is not the undoing of tradition, but the undoing of its inauthenticity, end quote. Lonergan's vision of human authenticity is oriented to responsibility in the context of community. There is a presumption in the positive sense that by cooperation with grace, one will be able to view and respond to human others and to the others in creation. And yet it is striking that Lonergan was soberly aware of the existence of an unnamed massive undertow of inauthenticity. Now, to speak of an undertow is to acknowledge the unseen and dangerous countercurrent or an opposite motion that can sweep one away. What remains then is to name it. Following M. Sean Copeland, Brian Massingale, who addressed the undertow of inauthenticity, I think in 2012, and so many others, it is clear that this undertow is generated in and by the Christian tradition through the interlocking problems of colonialism, racism, and the condition of whiteness. The deficit in subjectivity is evident when one attends to Copeland's powerful indictment of Catholic theology and the wider church for our failures to, quote, face up to the unexplained, unaccounted for, and unadmonished violence and killing of Black, brown, immigrant, female, LGBTQ, and indigenous bodies. And I feel this even now amidst opposition to mask and vaccination mandates and callous attitudes to the scandal of cultural genocide in places like Canada and others as well. The other does not appear as a fellow human being in these cases to whom I am accountable. And so in this paper, I identify hermeneutical resources for intersubjectivity in the works of Paul Ricoeur and Willie James Jennings that resonate with and assist in pursuing the authentic turn to persons that should result in Christian intersubjectivity. In a sort of exercise of Ricoeur's hermeneutical move from suspicion to retrieval, I will begin by linking the diagnosis of whiteness offered by Willie James Jennings with that massive undertow of inauthenticity. A hermeneutics of whiteness is key to thinking subjectivity in the present. And in a Jennings-inspired move of embracing what he calls Gentile existence, I will link the second undertow of the call to holiness to Ricoeur's hermeneutic philosophy of the self as a wounded cogito, which attests to our chastened capacity for just relation and even intimacy and communion, provided that one is open to every human other as well as the divine other. Thinking the self in a Ricoeurian lens is a second major hermeneutical resource that dovetails with Jennings. And from both thinkers, we find resources for intersubjectivity understood in Ricoeur's words as recognition of the other as my fellow human being, or in Jennings' terms, communion, intimacy, entrance into God's dream. So the first undertow. As Jennings and many other scholars rightly point out, the challenge of thinking intersubjectivity is that the norm for the subject is defined by the haunting legacy of whiteness. What Jennings means here is not to indict particular people of European descent as such, but to point to, quote, a way of being in the world and seeing the world that forms cognitive and affective structures able to seduce people into its habitation and its meaning-making. By now, Jennings' historical account of the emergence of the Christian imagination as whiteness has made a major impact, but it is still salient to look at moments in his account of the Christian imagination and in several other writings. In tracing the undertow of inauthenticity, then, I will focus on Jennings' account of the Western Christian self, then tie in similar insights in critical phenomenologies of race to further explicate the depth of this inauthenticity. The deformations of Christian subjectivity that Jennings narrates across his works are manifold. It is a reconfiguration of Christian abilities to imagine human others, environments and ecologies, space as a whole, and the Christian stance vis-a-vis God. One can look at the Commission of Nicholas V, through which Jennings analyzes how the Christian imagination gradually deformed itself, because already in Pope Nicholas's writings, one finds a reconfiguration of space based on a vision of the lordship of Jesus. The ensuing severance of people and their land through the slave trade and the colonial project in the Americas would bring about a harrowing performance of theology in the New World. In the case of Jose de Acosta, it is an interaction between a first hermeneutic of providence that views the discovery not only of peoples but of lands rich in natural resources as signs of divine favor on the colonizers' projects, and second, a hermeneutic of idolatry that not only interpreted indigenous peoples from a stance of confrontation against the demonic, but also did so while forgetting, quote, that Acosta and his people were also like the Indians, that they had once been Gentiles who did not know God. The absence of such a generosity of spirit is ironic in Acosta's case, given his Jesuit formation, but above all, it is tragic because it presumed that the indigenous, quote, lacked intelligence because they lacked European language and especially their signifiers for God, which could only fuel the perception of diabolical influence. This is only deepened by considering Acosta's typology of barbarian, quote-unquote, barbarian peoples. The first class resembles European norms in that they have developed communication networks, rules of law, social structures, and could be reasoned with in order to bring about conversion. The second class of barbarian had elementary writing systems and general organization and could be converted through appropriation and translation. But the third class, considered nothing more than quote-unquote wild animals, required force and imposed conversion. Underlying this all was a white theological gaze that could also discern the degree to which the demonic is at work in a given population, it is presumed. The transformation of place and space, the processes of displacement and separation in the colonial project, are what give rise to the concept of race and the epistemic condition of whiteness. Out of imperialism, whiteness functions as, quote, the facilitator of an aesthetic regime, unquote, and is at the center of the pedagogical character of racism. Closely linked to this whiteness is a hermeneutical theological problematic that goes to the heart of subjectivity. Inauthentic Christian subjectivity for Jennings stems from Christian forgetfulness of Jesus and Israel and of the Christian's own stance as a reader. Christianity is unintelligible without Israel. But the deeper challenge that Jennings identifies is whether Christian theology can explain how Israel is important to Christian existence. Here he observes, and the rest of this will be Jennings, there was already in place with the colonialist entrance in the new worlds of Americas and Africa, a failure of recognition equal to their failure to recognize the complexity and majesty of life marked by place. This failure of recognition was far more than simply forgetting Israel by claiming that Christian communitas surpassed their common life. This failure was more than poor knowledge of history or memory loss. The historic failure of recognition brings Christians to the threshold of Israel's existence with a basic life-altering question. How did we get here in the first place? Where is here? The here is outside Israel. Gentiles, the Goyim, are outside Israel. With this in mind, Jennings identifies as a task the retrieval of a Gentile hermeneutic. Such a retrieval acknowledges that God, quote, ruptures the way peoples imagine their collective existence, reorganizing what they know about God and how they should understand themselves in their land and in their world, unquote. It also places the Christian reader in their proper stance. They are graciously added on to a project of intimacy for the multitude inaugurated by Jesus. To read as Gentiles, then, is to shed a masterful Christian supersessionist and white racial gaze. It is to prioritize instead the subjectivity that stems from God, which alone enables authentic joining amidst difference, a rejoicing in the diversity and goodness of creation. It is also to embrace what John Copeland calls a thinking margin. Jennings wants to contend that Christians can perform marginality as a necessary movement toward new humanity precisely because it recognizes the prior graciousness and design of God to bring together a new humanity and therefore counteract an imperialist Christian vision. Embracing Gentile existence remains a present task. Jennings' most recent work, After Whiteness, attests to the present effects of whiteness in theological education, ruining gifts and stunting authentic Christian life in spaces that should form it. But to reiterate the importance of contending with that whiteness, I also want to briefly explore one resonance offered by Helen Yeo and her phenomenology of racism. And this reminds us of what is at stake in thinking subjectivity. It names the concrete experienced effects of whiteness on the one seen. Yeo points out that the racialized self experiences oneself as being seen as a threat, as an object, as non-human. What is more, the experiences of being seen as take place in events, but also in non-events, in the quotidian. They break even into the mundane to wound and disfigure. And what results from this experience of racism is an existential instability, such that one has to be on guard for the negative encounters that stem from a predetermined and overdetermined racialized gaze from elsewhere. Christian subjectivity is at the heart of the emergence and reification of that racial gaze. Its long history and enduring presence constitute the massive undertow plaguing our tradition. What is necessary to contend with this undertow is to retrieve Gentile existence, and to do so chastened by the harrowing legacy of the undertow historically and interpersonally. Now, taking up Gentile existence also means embracing a second undertow defined by Lonergan, the fateful call to a dreaded holiness, which can be explicated by the philosophical hermeneutics of the self in Paul Ricoeur alongside the work of Jennings. And so the second undertow. For Lonergan, the undertow of holiness is experienced in this way. The gift of God's love ordinarily is not objectified in knowledge, but remains within subjectivity as a dynamic vector, a mysterious undertow, a faithful call to a dreaded holiness. Because that dynamic state is conscious without being known, it is an experience of mystery. Because that dynamic state is being in love, the mystery is not merely attractive but fascinating. To one it belongs, by one it is possessed, unquote. It remains the case that humans can attest to their capacity for intersubjectivity. They can yield to an undertow of holiness or a call to justice. They can be carried over by the dynamic and transformative state of being in love with God. They can embrace Gentile existence. Thus, in this section, I want to draw from the work of Ricoeur as an initial stepping stone and frame for receiving the work of Jennings. Ricoeur's career is devoted to explicating a hermeneutical philosophical anthropology of the self. David Tracy has a more detailed version of that remains ever attentive to otherness. For Ricoeur, the self of our time is not an exalted cogito of Descartes, nor is it the shattered cogito in the wake of Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. Rather, it is a wounded self, wounded by the limits of selfhood, the realities of history and of memory, the injunction stemming from the other to embrace just living. Ricoeur has offered a handful of retrospective accounts of his philosophical career that emphasize three broad insights about the self. First, through his own forays into phenomenology in relation to the goodwill and human capacity, the problem of the bad will, and the experience of evil, reinforced that the self is not transparent to itself. And this is amplified by Ricoeur's turn to hermeneutics, which was occasioned by his philosophical reading of Sigmund Freud. Psychoanalysis as a practice demonstrates the opacity of the self. And in light of problems of a bad will and ideology and power, consciousness becomes no longer a given, but a task. Second, selfhood has to be thought through as reflexive. The third insight, and most important perhaps, is that a reflexive selfhood opens up into an account of the other such that one cannot think of selfhood apart from alterity or otherness. This is so important because it opens up selfhood to ethics. The second and third insights here are explored across Ricoeur's great work, Oneself as Another. Across several detailed studies, he first defines selfhood as reflexive from a grammatical and semantic analysis. It involves two dimensions, ipse identity and idem identity. In the case of ipse identity, there is an implication of the presence of the other. For example, if I say that my self-identity is defined by a capacity to act justly and to love responsibly, ipse identity points to the reality that I am imputable for that capacity to love and act justly, that another can hold me to my promise or count on my character. And by simple fact of the presence of another, then, ethics must be involved in any consideration of selfhood. Ethics for Ricoeur is defined as aiming at the good life for and with others in just institutions. The question emerges, who is this other and how is this other received? In Ricoeur's attempts to develop this ethical theory of selfhood, he engages significantly with the thought of Emmanuel Levinas on the concept of the face of the other. From Levinas and others, Ricoeur recognizes that at issue is, quote, the ethical primacy of the other than the self over the self. But here Ricoeur inserts a subtle and friendly critique in accounting for this face of the other. For Levinas, the face of the other is a manifestation, an eruption that breaks through the sameness of selfhood. It is, for him, and certainly for Jean-Luc Marion and others who follow him, infinite, even saturated, to the extent that the other's face renders an absolute moral injunction, don't kill me. But for Ricoeur, the initiative of the other in this way establishes no relation at all, because it is thoroughly epiphanic. But the call, the summons of responsibility not to kill, requires more than a passive or receptive eye. It needs a response. Accordingly, Ricoeur argues that thinking the self alongside the other requires solicitude, which is already expressed both in the Golden Rule and in the Great Commandment, do unto others as you would to yourself, love your neighbor as yourself. Of importance here in his linkage of self and other is an opening that allows others to quote unquote appear in their particularity. Although not always explicit in Ricoeur's final works, this regard for the other is nonetheless potent. He inserts into his philosophy of the self treatments of memory, history, and recognition, which together gesture towards the thinking margins of history. So, for example, in Memory, History, and Forgetting, and in the Course of Recognition, Ricoeur pivots from a general ethics of a good life for and with others to an articulation of the duty of memory in relation to history. To be brief, history is subject to abuse. The memories of eyewitnesses have a critical function in challenging history. In a telling moment, the French Ricoeur recognizes that quote-unquote official history is often predicated on an originary violent moment. One can think of the trauma of the French Revolution, or even of colonialist French projects. And so between memory and history, one needs to insert justice, which turns memory into a project. The duty of memory in this regard is the duty to quote-unquote do justice through memories to an other than the self. And here, the moral priority belongs above all to victims. What emerges in this account is a turn to the concept of recognition. And in a subtle yet profound manner, Ricoeur's final address lays bare what is at stake in an ethical account of selfhood in relation to recognition of the other. It is a matter of attesting to and following through on the human capacity to recognize, quote, the other, my fellow human being, unquote. How might the other be recognized? Ricoeur suggests not only a gift exchange of sorts as a means of recognition, but also the exchange of memories, of testimony, which in his context means turning towards the margins, recognizing oneself as them as fellow human beings, and being transformed by that encounter with the stories of human others. Such a recognition is very much within the realm of what humans can do. What remains then is to embrace the work. There is a clue as to how this can take place in Ricoeur's fascinating conclusion to oneself as another. Ever conscious of the boundary between philosophy and theology, Ricoeur only indicates the threshold of thinking the self alongside the other by reiterating his indebtedness to Levinas regarding attention to that other. Insofar as the other space is epiphanic, Ricoeur observes perhaps the philosopher as philosopher has to admit that one does not know and cannot say whether this other, the source of the injunction, is another person whom I can look at in the face, or my ancestors for whom there is no representation, or God, living God, absent God, or an empty place. With this aporia of the other, philosophical discourse comes to an end. Who is this other? In separately published lectures, Ricoeur gives a clue. The self is addressed by Scripture and therefore by God. But I'll turn to Jennings for what Ricoeur would call a refiguration of the self before the other that is God. At stake in contending with whiteness is what Jennings calls the original trajectory of intimacy or communion, which is nothing less than recognition of the other as a fellow human being and their uniqueness and specificity. And Jennings communicates this in a fascinating way. It is a matter of yielding to a dream, God's dream, of ending hostility and drawing people in their difference into life joined together. He explains, quote, God offers us an uncontrollable reconciliation, one that aims to recreate us, reform us as those who enact gathering and who gesture communion with our very existence. It is a divine other, God, who calls Gentiles and enables Gentiles to enter into this project of joining, into the space opened up by Jesus. Ricoeur's hermeneutic philosophy of the self contains all the elements for a philosophical contention with whiteness. The wounded self needs to be wounded above all by the memory and effects of whiteness. It needs to be open to the other, to real persons and bodies who bleed. And he offers a philosophical frame that Jennings only refigures theologically by pointing to the need to retrieve Gentile existence and marginality as a means of building life together. This is my conclusion. I focused here on Lonergan's surprising twofold language of the undertow in order to address whiteness as the major challenge to intersubjectivity and to also name the opportunity and necessity of committing to a different future. I believe it's necessary to cultivate this sense, not only because the problem of whiteness persists and unfortunately will continue to do so, but because even this critical engagement can, in Jennings' words, open up different possibilities for theological reflection and practice. Confronted by the tragic history of the Christian imagination, one can pursue a more authentic subjectivity by yielding as a Gentile to a second undertow of holiness. For it is this transformation of being in love with God and allowing that love to unfold that can give rise to that good life for and with others in just institutions, and the more affective recognition